Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to part 2 of our Bastion playthrough. Obviously we were introduced to the Kyrian at the start, and now we start to learn a little bit more about their culture and exactly how this all comes to fruition as they move on to aspirants. We've now moved on to an area which seems to be more heavily focused around training, and as I mentioned before, we start to think about more in regards to our past selves. We follow these rituals that uncover past thoughts, past events. And to start off with, it actually is quite interesting because it pulls off from some of the most recent expansions. You commune with this eternal flame, and there is a small little change in the scenario, and suddenly you find yourself completely surrounded by Alliance characters. You see Horde characters there also fighting them as it takes place during the Fourth War. This isn't the first time that we've seen something like this happen. Various other expansions have had sort of throwbacks to the past, but this definitely does seem as though it is, you know, one of the first moments where we can, you know, realistically take a look at the process of becoming a Kyrian. This continues on for another 3 times. We find ourselves fighting the Iron Horde here in this flashback. Again, it seems as though it's slightly revisionist because it doesn't make any real mention of the Legion during this, when we know that the Legion were a big part of Warlords of Draenor. However, there is a much bigger part of revisionist history coming up in just a moment, which is obviously this next vision here. It mentions that we are defending the Pandaren, and it shows Mogu, but at no point does it make any mention of Garrosh. Now, here on Warcraft Radio, we're pretty divided, but myself, Garrosh did nothing wrong, so I don't mind this, but it seems odd that it focuses on some very negative you know, obviously enemies that we faced during these expansions, but again, the Mogu were never really the big enemy. We did defend the Pandaren, but we also defended the Horde and the Alliance from it. So it seems odd that they are going for that style of, you know, how these dreams, how these thoughts are brought out, how these memories are played out here in this zone. Again, like I said, this is the first step into what we really understand about the Kyrians and how this process begins. It's quite a slow start to this area, I'm not going to lie. I fully understand if people are a little bit worried at how this all, you know, how this all begins, but trust me, it gets much better later on into the zone, and even this area as a whole does get better as we continue forward. Once this is all done, we then obviously get our crest reward. One thing I'd like to note is, as I'm going through this, will see that there are certain quests that will pop up with loot as a reward. You'll get some form of armor or weapon. However, in between this and other expansions, there seems to be a lot less loot. We've obviously heard them talking about how they want to remove stuff like Warforging, Titan Forging, Corruption, and part of that is that they are looking at reducing the amount of loot that drops, the amount of loot that you as a character gain. It's interesting to note that at the end of this zone, I have obviously gone, as of recording this voiceover, I've completed pretty much all the footage, so I've seen exactly how the zone ends. In most other expansions, you almost always have a full, complete set of gear from this zone, and the moment you come in, unless you're in mythic gear from the previous raid, you're pretty much into the brand new expansion's gear by the end of the first zone. In this one, I believe I only have half of my slots taken over by the new gear. Now, depending on how the item level works is going to massively depend on exactly how quickly your gear is replaced in Bastion, but it's nice to see it doesn't just instantly flow away from you and you're kind of left then going, oh well, here I am replacing all my gear that I earned in the last expansion, and all of a sudden it's replaced. This latest quest that we're on, we are tasked in gathering some Anima, again looking at Anima as a whole, and relighting a forge. This, of course, now summons the attention of some of the wildlife. The wildlife themselves also seem to be focused on Anima. As you can see, this etherworm here has been drawn by us using the Anima Forge here to create it. And it's something that will continue on throughout the zone, in Anima being a big part, Anima being something that a lot of people need to be aware of. Again, happy to see it's not some form of artifact power or currency that we need to use, but at the same time, it's fairly obvious it's going to play a big part towards the end game. This is more of our introduction to it. This quest is a standard kill quest. There are, I wouldn't say there are a lot of these. You do have you know, some kill quests that do happen throughout the zone. A lot of them are disguised as various different types of quests, but in here you're just gathering the usual. You're gathering flowers and you're gathering guts to help with getting this forge started up. It's interesting to note that whilst there are a lot of quests that, you know, do sort of like continue the story, a lot of them, they do tend to go, here's a kill quest, a collection quest, into something that is slightly more story based. It does kind of turn around and say, okay, now we need to look at something else. Moving on here, you'll notice that there is a rare on the map, and I do decide to go and have a look. This is something that is slightly different. It isn't a mob that is just standing out in the world. This is some form of teacher that is giving a lesson about a certain animal. This one happens to be a Terrapin. The Terrapin then gets spawned and you kill it. However, this is different creatures as I've gone through. I've seen people fighting a Corsair, I've seen people fighting some form of a bird, a Terrapin. It seems as though there's a different rare, or if this event is what is considered the rare, and then it just depends on what you get. It seems as though the loot across the board is the same. It's not a case of, oh, I've killed the Terrapin, I get this loot, I've killed the bird, I get this loot. It does seem to be pretty much the same across the board, so you don't have to worry about targeting a particular animal or having to redo this on multiple characters to get different toys or a chance at a cosmetic appearance or anything like that. It's just something that you can kind of, as you walk past, you don't know what you quite get. I'm not 100% sure if this is something that you can change or wait for. It does always seem to be set. I haven't seen any particular changes from, say, one visit to another. It's possible it could be tied to killing the rare. So if I've killed the Terrapin in 15 minutes, we could find that we are then fighting against the bird, for example. It does entirely depend on how they want to reset these. Now, once we turn these in, we do kind of fall into that routine, as I said before, of once you've gathered something, so say a kill quest or something along those lines, you then get a slightly different flavour of quest. Gives you a little bit of variety. It means that you're not constantly going, right, okay, I'm killing this. Now I've got to go kill this. Now I've got to kill this bad guy. It's more a case of, okay, there's a reason for me killing these. I'm not just here saying, oh, it's told me to kill 10 of these because they're a problem. But no, there's a reason for me killing them. We're now introduced to a Anima Forge. This does seem to be an introduction to something that will become more important later on. However, it's not just a case of clicking it and away you go. There are certain tasks that need to be done. We end up cleaning the forge. It obviously hasn't been used in some time. You'll notice that there is a small owl-like creature on the screen right now. These are called the stewards. They're essentially the sort of caretakers, the janitors of Bastion. They don't necessarily, they're not called slaves, they choose to do this, and it's even mentioned in the quest previously at the end that if they aren't able to do their jobs, they actually get a little bit annoyed. They almost feel as though they're not doing what they are supposed to be doing. Here is something that we haven't actually done before in a single quest. We've obviously had quests such as the famous Whirlwind Axe quest back in vanilla, and we've had crafting quests before, but this one, you, instead of getting materials and then them handing you the item, you actually help them create the item. So here we have to judge how much heat is going into the forge, making sure it's not getting too hot, ensuring that if it does get too hot, we're opening the vents. If it does get too cold, we're making sure to put more heat in there. It's a little bit of a mini-game. I will say on the alpha, it was probably slightly bugged, because it did mean that if you were doing this quest alongside somebody else, it was picking up the inputs of every single person on that quest. So at the start, there was about 4 or 5 people trying to do it, and the heat meter was jumping all over the place. It wasn't exactly the best environment for this sort of quest. Here, you have to delicately manage this heat of a forge, but you're not the one that is looking at exactly what is going on. You're almost having to sit back and hope that everyone else is doing the same thing as you. You know, some people are undoing the vents, some people are throwing fuel in, the temperature gauge goes all over the place. I haven't actually seen what happens if you fail that. I'm assuming it's pretty much impossible, but who knows. Once we've done this, we then hold steady the armor for the blacksmith to essentially imbue the armor with anima. As they mentioned, precision is key with something like this, and at the end of it, we do get ourselves a new chest piece. It does seem a little bit arbitrary as to what pieces give you loot. For example, the last quest that you do in this zone, you don't actually get a piece of loot from it. You only get your experience and a little bit of gold. It's very, very odd whether or not you do, you know, I'd imagine if there was a quest at the end of the zone, you would actually get some form of loot, whether it be a weapon, something big, a trinket, something along those lines, to almost say congratulations for completing it, but we will have to wait and see as to whether or not that stays. This could be the first pass through all of them. Now, at this point, you're supposed to move on to what is essentially an arena. It's almost a sparring area. However, if you're like me, you will actually go in completely the wrong direction. What I will say is that these sort of like waypoints that appear on the map can sometimes be a little bit of a savior, simply because the area, whilst it looks very beautiful, when you get into the areas where there are multiple branching paths, it can start to look slightly samey. It's probably something that, you know, it's a minor gripe. I'm not exactly going to turn around and say this has to be changed, otherwise Shadowlands is ruined forever. It's something that is only small, and is probably down to not paying close enough attention as you're going around doing your quests. Speaking of, it's time for the sparring portion of the questline, and this again ties into the aspect of the Kyrians being quite a military heavily focused covenant. They do seem to have a big part of it is based around making sure you can defend yourself, making sure that as you are sort of helping the souls from the Maw to the Arbiter, or sorry, not from the Maw because the Maw is where they go, but from the Arbiter to wherever they are needed, whether it be Bastion, whether it need to be Maldraxxus, Revendreth. It seems as though there is an aspect of you being able to A, defend yourself, and B, also drive back attackers. Once you've defeated your 8 sparring partners, you do move on to these. They are what I would call sparring robots almost. They're testing your strength. They do have some very, very basic abilities that you have to avoid. For example, this one has a 3-blade strike where he appears in a certain area and will strike that area 3 times. I will say that these do a lot less damage than they did during BlizzCon. When myself and Athalas were testing this footage, there was one of the mobs that killed me fairly handily, to be honest. As you saw there, I stood in the 3-strike circle as he did the ability, and I took hardly any damage. I didn't even drop below 70%, I believe. So it seems as though these guys do need a little bit of a buff. It's slightly odd that they don't do that much damage. This one here does a very, very similar thing. He does a whirling cone. Not a whirling cone, a whirling ability on the floor. Stops you from just being able to stand there and nuke him down here. Crescent Strike is what they all have. It seems to be some very, very basic melee ability. The Whirling Blades is quite annoying because he does just tend to teleport all over the shop. I will say they seem to have slightly more health than I would be comfortable with. It seems as though the abilities that do the damage versus the health that these mobs have seems to be slightly off, because they just take a lot longer to kill, versus the other mobs that are in the area. I can understand they are more a training exercise for you to avoid certain abilities, but at the same time, the abilities themselves don't actually do that much damage. I'd much rather see these mobs have a much lower health pool, but do slightly more damage on their main abilities. So, for example, the strike that the previous boss did, and the whirling strike that this boss does. This is the boss that actually killed me in the BlizzCon demo. It's nowhere near as dangerous. It does almost like a whirlwind type ability with Anima that does next to no damage whatsoever. I was slightly disappointed with this. Again, the health doesn't seem to be... There we go, the whirling Anima doesn't really do that much damage, actually. If you'll actually notice, it appears as though I'm stood in the actual circle. My health doesn't move at all, so it's slightly off balancing the fact that they have so much health and they take so long to kill. The other two more so than this one. That it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There's the whirling Anima again, and as you can see, I'm standing in it and I'm hardly taking any damage. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. It's, again, the balance between the actual health of the mobs versus the damage they do doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense to me. Once we hand these in, we have the final test that is set up here in Bastion at the sparring area, and it is the big dude in the middle of this arena. This is Athenos. He is a fight that you can't win. It seemed to be sort of structured that way. There's no real way of completing it. He's got way too much health, as you can see there. He's got almost 2 million health. His damage is pretty high, and he does have a one-shot mechanic once you have done a certain amount of damage to him. It seems to be around about the 12k mark. That doesn't mean that it is going to be the same come live. It could be based on a timer. Luckily, you do get healed up, so you don't have to worry about, am I going to die straight away, or this just seems to kill me and nothing else happens after that. It's part and parcel of the experience of becoming a Kyrian. But once again, ladies and gentlemen, my name has been Kexman, and thank you for joining me for part 2 of Bastion. Part 3 will be coming up tomorrow, and then as the week goes on, we'll be diving deeper and deeper into the story of Bastion.